The final example that we have on creating the plugins, we'll use a different dashboard, and I'll pull up the Scale Marker plugin dashboard. This final example pulls everything together that we've been working on so far. And so we can see that we've got the bar going out to the value that we wanted. We can also see that our value for the other bars are corresponding with the data funnel. So let's click on the graph and look at the actual data. We see the target is 7250 and last year to date is the 6554. And as we come back, the target is up here in the 7,000s and the last year to date is at the 6,500. So we'll now discuss how we would create the plugin to actually pull the data from the data funnel and then position the bars accordingly. So I'm now going to switch over and look at the version of the plugin that implements this. One thing to note down below here is now we can see that rather than an ITXML plugin, I am calling this through the include plugin. Again, at the end of the plugin, we showed that this could be used either way. This could be included as ITXML or include. The other thing we can see is up here we have some parameters now that have been defined. I've got a data funnel name parameter, and if I click on the parameters, I see that I've got some descriptions showing up telling me what this parameter does. I've got the graph name, and that would be the graph that we're actually targeting. As we look over here to the left in our object browser, you can see the graph name under Corda image, and that tells us which element we are targeting with this plugin. I've got a line width, and that would be for my red line to tell it that it's 2 pixels wide. I've got a line column. This references, again we have the description, but it references the column of the data funnel that it's targeting that has the data for the line. The last item on the line is the color. We then have the range column if there happens to be a range, and a range color. And last off is this graph a vertical or a horizontal bar graph? You also can note that some of these values for the parameters actually have drop downs where you're allowed to select a value as opposed to just typing something in. You have the ability when you create the plugin to specify this information, specify the name of the parameters that you want to use, specify the descriptions for each of those parameters, and also to specify a list of possible values if you choose to do so. That is an optional part of plugin creation. So I will say OK here, and we will now go to the plugin and look at how this is created. So I'm going back to IntelliJ, and this time we're going to pull up a different plugin, Scale Marker plugin, and this one is much more complete than the previous version that we had. Again, we're pulling from the Corda package. The name now is Scale Marker plugin. We're using the same version as previously. I have an extra method that I've created here that will get a parameter for you. Down below in our code, as we look at the different methods, here's the getITXML method. So this is the area you would enter if you're just doing a getITXML, or getIncludeXML would reference this as well. It passes in the request info object, which is very key to writing a plugin because we will use that request info object to get the parameters that we just saw. You'll see that the first thing I do in this plugin is I call my method called getParameter, and I pass into that the name of the parameter that I'm looking for. I pass in a default for that value, and then I pass in the request info. Up above here, if we look at the getParameter call, you can see that I essentially use that request info object to ask for the parameter value. If I get that value, I will use it. If I don't, I will type in, or I will use the default value that I've passed into this method. This just makes it a lot easier to handle cases where somebody may be writing a plugin that the user may or may not be typing in any values. You can still make your plugin work even if they type in no values at all. So the first thing I do in the plugin is to get all the variables, and these are the ones that we just barely looked at in the parameter dialog. From there, I will pull out the column number that has the range. I will pull out the column number that has the line values from the data funnel. And the next thing we're going to do is actually try and go out and get the data that we're going to be graphing. So here we can see a method called getData, and this method, which can be called from your data or from your plugin, can actually go out to any of your data funnels and pull in a two-dimensional grid of strings which contains the data. So the first thing I'm doing is saying get the data for the data funnel that they've given me the name for, and assuming that I've gotten that data, I then want to go out and do something with that. The main method that you're going to see here is getScaleMarker ITXML. And once I've gotten the value that I'm trying to use the scale marker for, I pass that in as well as these other values that I have, like the colors and the labels and other information. And I will pass that information then into my routine that actually creates the XML. Now this routine is essentially the same as what we saw before in the previous version, other than now I'm passing in a bunch of parameters so that I can determine if it's horizontal or vertical, what those parameters should be, and I can pass in parameters such as the values themselves, which will be appended within these strings as you can see them in the routine. So the final result is this ITXML that I'm creating with the parameters that were passed into the plugin will be returned to CenterView, and CenterView can then take those values that came from our data funnel and it can graph those with the graph. Now the final thing that I want to show here is the methods that have been implemented which will allow you to use this plugin or allow other people to use the plugin that might not be as familiar with how it works. The first method I have, and again these are optional methods, you don't have to implement them for the plugin to work, but it makes it much easier for others to use your plugin. The first method here is getDefaultParameterString. When the user types in the name of this plugin, he will be given this list of parameters. Now it's advantageous for you to put in all the names of the parameters in this string, even if you don't want to give them a value. That will allow your user to see the names of the parameters, and then he can type in a value for that parameter. And you can see that I've done that for the data funnel name. There's no value, and the same thing for the graph name. The next thing I have is get parameter descriptions. This allows me to associate with each of the parameter names a description, which will be displayed in the dialog that we were looking at previously. And the last item I have is get parameter values. This method will allow you to associate with each one of the parameters a list of values that can be used for that parameter. And if you specify these, this is where you will get the combo box or the drop down that actually gets displayed in the dialog for the parameters. So in the end, we've gone through the process of creating this scale marker plugin. The value of doing something like this is now I have this piece of code that maybe I want to display several of these graphs side by side. I want the data for all of them to come from different data funnels, and I don't have to go out and write a separate piece of ITXML for each of them. The plugin can just hook up to the data funnel and change these values and the text and the lines and everything that I'm looking at here dynamically without my having to write that again. And hopefully you can see how we started by just going directly to the ITXML and cutting essentially the piece that we wanted, taking that into a plugin, and then modifying it within the plugin to be able to pass in parameters and change some of the values of how that would function. And hopefully that'll help you to see how you might write your own custom plugins.